The dress cost $4 at a church thrift sale, and the woman wearing it had been told 3 times in one evening that she did not belong in the room. She stood near the tall windows of the gala hall with a glass of water she had not touched, and she let the words slide off her the way rain slides off good wool. What none of them knew, not the woman in the emerald gown who had laughed loudest, not the photographer, not the host who kept checking his watch, was that the dress that had just been mocked in front of 200 people had been sewn, stitch by careful stitch, by the very hands now folded quietly at the wearer's waist. She had made it herself. She had made a great many things, and before the night was over, every person who had turned away from her would learn exactly whose work they had been laughing at. Her name was Nia Carter, and she was 41 years old, and she had not wanted to come to the gala at all. She had come because her granddaughter asked her to, and because a person says yes to a granddaughter when she can. Nia had spent 30 years behind a sewing machine in a narrow shop on the east side of the city, a shop with a bell over the door and a window full of dress forms and a hand-lettered sign that read alterations and repairs. She had hemmed wedding gowns and let out funeral suits and turned 1,000 torn linings into whole ones. Her fingers were quick and sure and marked with the small white scars of a lifetime of needles. She had raised a daughter on that machine. And when the daughter died young, she had raised the daughter's child the same way, one seam at a time. The shop was not much to look at from the street. The paint on the sign had faded to the colour of weak tea, and the bell over the door had a crack in it that gave its ring a flat, friendly note Nia had stopped hearing years ago. Inside there was the long work table scarred with chalk lines and pinholes, a wall of thread spools arranged by colour the way other people arrange books, 3 dress forms, named by Tessa as a child, after the women on a soap opera Nia never watched, and the machine itself, an old black workhorse Nia had bought second-hand at 19 and rebuilt twice with her own hands. People came in with emergencies. A zipper that gave out an hour before a job interview, a funeral suit that no longer fit a body that grief had changed, a prom dress a mother could not afford to buy and could afford to alter. Nia took them all. She charged what people could pay, and when they could not pay, she found a way to make the math come out so that nobody left feeling they had taken charity, because she had learned long ago that pride is the last thing a poor person owns and the first thing the world tries to take. She had buried her own daughter at 34. Carla had been 26, and the loss had hollowed Nia out in a way she never spoke about, and then it had handed her in the same breath a 4-year-old girl with Carla's exact laugh and nowhere else to go. Nia had not hesitated. She had moved Tessa's crib into the room behind the shop, and she had sewn through the nights with the child sleeping 10 feet away, and she had built a life for the two of them out of other people's torn hems. There had been months she ate cereal for dinner so Tessa could have a coat. There had been a winter, the heat went out, and she ran the iron in the machine just to keep the back room warm. She never once told Tessa any of this, because a child should not carry the weight of being expensive to love. Tessa had grown up thinking they had always been fine. In a way that mattered, they had been. The granddaughter was named Tessa, and she was 24, and she worked in the front office of a fashion house downtown, the kind of place with marble floors, and a name that meant something to people who cared about such names. Tessa answered phones and managed calendars and watched, from her desk near the door, the world her grandmother had spent a lifetime serving from the outside. The gala that night was the house's annual benefit, and Tessa had been given 2 tickets, and she had used one of them to bring the person she loved most in the world. She had not understood, when she did it, what she was walking her grandmother into. Nia had made the dress for the occasion because she could not afford to buy one and would not have wanted to anyway. She had found the fabric folded at the bottom of a remnant bin, a deep midnight blue silk with a faint silver thread running through it, the kind of bolt end a mill discards because there is not enough of it to sell. She had paid $4 for the whole length. She had cut it on her own kitchen table over 3 evenings, working by the lamp after the shop closed, and she had built a gown the way she built everything, with a hidden structure most people would never see and would only feel as rightness. The seams were French finished, so no raw edge ever touched skin. The hem was weighted with a thin chain, so the skirt moved like water. She had set the sleeves by hand. When she put it on in her small bedroom and turned in front of the mirror, she had looked for a moment like someone who had been born to wear silk. She had measured herself in the bathroom mirror with a tape held between her teeth the way she had measured 1,000 other women, and found it strange to be the body on the other side of the chalk for once. She had drafted the pattern from scratch on the back of brown wrapping paper, no commercial envelope to follow, just the numbers and 30 years of knowing how cloth wants to fall. The $4 had bothered her at first. It seemed too little to make a thing she would wear in front of important people. Then she had reminded herself of what she told every bride who flinched at the price of good work, that the cost of a dress is not in the fabric, but in the hands, and that her hands had never once made anything cheap. She had pricked her finger on the second evening and pressed it to her mouth so the blood would not mark the silk, and she had laughed at herself, alone in the kitchen, 41 years old, and still bleeding for a hem. When she finished, she hung the dress on the back of the door and looked at it for a long time, and she thought it was the finest thing she had ever made, and she was right. What she did not know was who else would be at the gala. What she did not know was that the woman who ran the fashion house, the woman whose name was on the marble, had spent the last 2 years searching quietly for a person she could not find. The trouble started at the coat check. Nia handed over a thin wool wrap she had made from a thrifted blanket, and the attendant took it between 2 fingers as though it might leave a residue. Then, in the hall, a circle of women in beaded gowns parted just enough to let Nia through and closed again behind her, and one of them said, not quite quietly enough, that she did not realize the staff were allowed to mingle. A second woman murmured something about the dress code, and the 2 of them laughed into their glasses. Nia heard all of it. She had ears trained by 30 years of women talking over her head while she pinned their hems, and she had long ago learned the trick of letting unkind words pass through her without lodging anywhere. She found a place by the window. She had spent a lifetime being unseen, in rooms like this, fitting the hems of the women who filled them, kneeling at their feet with pins in her mouth while they talked over her head as if she were furniture. She knew how to stand in such a room. She knew how to wait. The window glass was cool against her shoulder, and beyond it the city went on in the rain, and she thought, not bitterly, that she would rather be out there in the wet with the working people than in here with the dry ones who had forgotten how to see anybody. The woman in the emerald gown was named Camille Brandt, and she was the wife of one of the evening's largest donors, and she had a talent for finding the one person in any room who could not answer her back. She saw Nia by the window. She saw the homemade dress, and she mistook handwork for poverty, which is a mistake that wealth makes, often. She crossed the floor with 2 friends trailing her, and she stopped in front of Nia, and she looked her up and down with a smile that had no warmth in it at all. "Did you make that yourself?" Camille said, and the friends laughed before Nia could answer, because the question was not a question. It was a verdict. Camille reached out and rubbed a fold of the skirt between her thumb and forefinger, the way a buyer tests cheap goods at a market. "You did. Oh, you poor thing. There are stores now, you know, places that sell things ready to wear. You didn't have to do all this." Nia did not pull the fabric away. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Camille with the same steady calm she brought to a difficult alteration, and she said, "Yes, I made it myself." "It shows," Camille said, and turned, and the 3 of them walked back into the bright center of the room, pleased with themselves, already telling the story to someone else. Across the hall, near her desk, by the entrance, Tessa had seen the whole thing. Her face had gone hot. She started forward, and Nia caught her eye and gave one small shake of the head, the way she had 100 times across a crowded shop. The gesture that meant, "Let it go, it costs us nothing." Tessa stopped. She did not understand yet that her grandmother was right in a way no one in that room could have guessed. If you have ever stood in a room where people decided who you were before you opened your mouth, you already know how the next hour felt to Nia, and you already know why she stayed. She stayed because leaving would have made the dress a thing to be ashamed of, and she was not ashamed of it. She stayed by the window with her glass of water, and she watched the gala turn, and she waited for the evening to end so she could take her granddaughter home. To understand why the dress mattered, you have to go back 22 years to a different room and a much harder season. Nia had been 19 when she opened the shop, working out of a rented storefront with a single second-hand machine and a folding chair. She took in any work she could get. She sewed costumes for a community theatre that paid in promises. She let out the waistbands of men who had lost their jobs and could not afford new suits for interviews. And once, in the cold of a January that she remembered for the rest of her life, a young woman had come into the shop in tears, holding a wedding dress that did not fit, and a wedding 3 days away, and a purse with almost nothing in it. The young woman's name was Diane, and she was getting married on a budget that had no room in it for a tailor. The dress had been her mother's, and her mother was gone, and the dress was 2 sizes too large and torn along one seam where someone had tried to alter it badly. Diane had been turned away from 2 other shops that morning because she could not pay what they asked. She stood in Nia's narrow storefront, and she said she understood if Nia could not help her either, and she turned to go. Nia remembered the exact light in the shop that afternoon, the grey January light that came through the front window and lay flat across the work table. She remembered the way Diane held the dress bundled against her chest like something she was afraid of dropping, the lace gone yellow at the edges the way old lace goes. The girl could not have been more than 22. She had cried so much already that day that she had stopped being embarrassed by it, and she stood there with her face raw and her hands shaking, and she said the words people say when they have been told no all day, that it was fine, that she would figure something out, that she was sorry to have wasted Nia's time. She had her hand on the door. Nia had looked at her own rent envelope half-filled sitting on the counter. She had looked at the dress. Then she had set the envelope aside and she had said, "Sit down, we have 3 days." She worked on Diane's dress for 2 of those days and most of 2 nights. She did not charge her for the labour. She charged her only for the thread because Diane would not accept nothing, and Nia understood that a person sometimes needs to pay something to keep her dignity. Nia rebuilt the bodice from the inside, boning it with featherweight stays so it would hold its shape against a body 2 sizes smaller than the one it was cut for. She took the dress in at the side seams and added a panel where the fabric had torn, cutting the new piece from the long train so the join would never show, matching the weave so carefully that even she had to look twice afterward to find it. She pressed every seam flat with an iron she heated on the stove, because the shop's iron had broken. She worked past midnight both nights, with Tessa asleep in the back room and the radio low, and on the second night, when her eyes blurred and her shoulders ached, she had thought about the rent and almost stopped. And then she had thought about a girl with no mother getting married in 3 days, and she had threaded another needle. When Diane put the dress on the 3rd day and stood in front of the mirror, she had wept, and she had said she did not know how to thank her, and Nia had said the only thanks she wanted was an invitation to see a photograph someday. Diane was married that weekend. She sent Nia a photograph in a card, the 2 of them in front of a small church, the dress fitting as though it had been made for her, which in a sense by then it had. And then life carried Diane away the way it does to another city and another life. And Nia put the photograph in a drawer and went on with her work. And she did not think of that January very often, except sometimes when a frightened bride came through the door and she remembered what it was to save someone with nothing but a needle and a little time. What Nia did not know, what she could not have known, was that Diane had kept the dress and that Diane had told the story of the dress to her own daughter every year on her anniversary, and that Diane's daughter had grown up to build one of the most respected fashion houses in the country, and that the daughter had spent 2 years looking for the seamstress her mother could never stop talking about, the one whose name had been lost when an old card was thrown away in a move, and whose shop her mother only ever called the little place on the east side. The daughter's name was Renee, and she was the woman whose name was on the marble floor of the gala hall, and she had not yet come down from her office upstairs. Back in the present, the gala wore on. There were speeches. Nia could not hear well from the window. There was an auction of donated items, paintings and weekends in faraway houses, the prices climbing into numbers that would have kept Nia's shop open for a decade. Camille won a bid on a diamond bracelet and held up her wrist for the photographer, and as the flash went off, she glanced toward the window where Nia stood and let her smile sharpen, just slightly, just enough to be sure the seamstress saw what a real dress looked like when a real woman wore it. Tessa came to stand beside her grandmother. She brought her a small plate of food Nia had not asked for and would not eat, and she stood close, and she said, "Lo, I'm sorry. I didn't know they'd be like this. I thought it would be different. It's the same room I've worked in my whole life," Nia said. "I just usually have pins in my hand." She smiled, then a real one, and squeezed her granddaughter's arm. "I'm here because you asked me. That's the only reason I needed. Don't let them take that from either of us." Tessa nodded, but her jaw was tight, and Nia could see the anger banked behind her eyes, the helpless fury of a young person watching someone she loves be made small. Nia knew that fury. She had felt it for her own daughter, and for Tessa, more times than she could count. She wanted to tell her granddaughter that the room was wrong, that a person's worth is not the price of her clothes, that the women laughing tonight would not remember Nia's name in a week, while Nia would remember every kindness she had ever given for the rest of her life. The words would have sounded like a sermon, though, and Nia did not preach. She just stood, and she waited, and she let the night carry them both toward whatever was coming. What was coming was a small thing, at first. A woman from the catering staff, hurrying past with a tray, caught the heel of her shoe on the edge of a rug and stumbled, and the tray tipped, and a full glass of red wine arced through the air toward a guest in a pale gown. The guest jumped back, the glass missed her by inches and shattered on the marble. And in the scramble, the catering woman's apron strap, an old strap, worn thin, snapped clean through, so that she stood in the middle of the bright floor, with her apron sagging and her face crumpling, and 200 wealthy strangers staring at her like she was a stain to be cleaned up. A man near the bar said something under his breath about the help, and a small ripple of laughter went around the circle. The easy laughter of people who have never once had to mop up after anyone. The catering woman's face went the particular shade of a person trying not to cry in front of strangers, and she crouched and began gathering the larger pieces of glass with bare fingers, fast and clumsy, just wanting to be gone. No one helped her. The guest in the pale gown had already turned away to tell the story. The host signaled to someone across the room with a small, irritated gesture of a man who wanted a mess made invisible. Nia moved before she thought about it. She crossed the floor with the same unhurried purpose she brought to everything, and she knelt, and she gathered the broken glass into a napkin with her bare hands so no one would step on it, taking the woman's wrist gently when she reached for a jagged piece and guiding her hand away from it. Then she stood, and she turned to the catering woman, whose name tag read Lorna. She said, quietly, so that only Lorna could hear, "Hold still. I can fix that." She took the small folding kit she carried in her wrap, the one she never went anywhere, without a needle already threaded, a few pins, a thimble worn smooth. She knelt again and she mended the apron strap right there on the floor, 4 quick stitches, a knot, the thread bitten clean, while the gala stared and the catering woman stood frozen and grateful above her. Her hands did not hurry and did not shake. They did the work they had done 10,000 times, the small, precise work of putting a broken thing back together, and around her the bright, cruel room seemed to go quiet and far away. Because when Nia was sewing, she was always, in a sense, the steadiest person present, the only one who could actually mend what was torn. It took less than a minute. When Nia rose, the strap held, and Lorna's apron sat straight again, and Lorna's eyes were wet, and she said thank you in a voice that shook. "It's nothing," Nia said. "I've done it 10,000 times." And she walked back to her window as though she had done nothing worth noticing at all. Someone had been watching this time, though. Someone had come down at last from the office upstairs and had stepped out onto the mezzanine that overlooked the hall, and from the railing she had seen the whole of it. The spill, the stairs, the woman in the homemade midnight blue dress, crossing the floor without being asked, kneeling on marble in silk, mending a stranger's apron with a needle she carried like a 6th finger. Renee stood very still at the railing. She had seen a great many things in her years in this business. She had not seen that. She had been searching for 2 years for a woman who would do exactly that. Renee came down the wide stairs slowly. She was a tall woman of 44 in a plain grey gown that cost more than everything in Nia's shop combined and announced none of it. and she moved through the gala with the quiet that real power does not need to perform. People turned toward her, and she did not stop for them. She crossed the floor to the window, and the circle of women who had laughed at Nia an hour before fell silent and parted. The way circles do when the center of gravity in a room shifts, Renee stopped in front of her. She looked at the dress, and her eyes moved over it the way a builder reads a building, the structure under the surface, the hand behind the work. "You made this," Renee said. It was not the question Camille had asked. Camille had asked to mock. Renee asked the way a person asked to be sure of something that matters. "I did," Nia said. "The seams are French finished," Renee said. "There's weight in the hem. Chain?" Nia nodded, and something in Renee's face moved. "You set the sleeves by hand." "It's how I was taught," Nia said. "Who taught you?" "Nobody. I taught myself." "Mostly." "A long time ago." "In a little shop," Nia smiled. "You learn fast when you can't afford to ruin the fabric." Renee was quiet for a moment. The hall had grown quiet around them too, the way a room does when it senses something happening that it does not understand. Then Renee said in a careful voice, "Can I ask you something? A long time ago, more than 20 years, did you ever fix a wedding dress for a woman named Diane? For almost nothing, 3 days before her wedding." Nia's hand went still on her glass. The name reached back across 2 decades and touched something she had folded away and almost forgotten. "Diane," she said slowly, "the January bride. The dress that was her mother's." She looked at Renee, and she saw it then. The resemblance, the same line of the jaw, the same wide-set eyes she had looked into across a sewing table while a frightened young woman cried over a torn seam. "You're her girl." "I'm her daughter," Renee said, and her voice was not steady anymore. "She told me about you every single year. Every anniversary she put on that dress as long as it still fit, and she told me about the woman on the east side who saved her wedding and only charged her for the thread. She never knew your name. The card got lost. I have been looking for you for 2 years. I had people calling every alteration shop in 3 states. She stopped. She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, and when she lowered it, she said, "My mother died last spring." The dress was the last thing she asked to hold. The gala had gone fully silent. Now the women who had laughed stood with their drinks forgotten in their hands. Camille stood at the edge of the circle with her diamond bracelet catching the light and her smile gone, beginning slowly to understand what she had done to whom. "I made a panel for that dress out of the train," Nia said softly, almost to herself, the memory coming back whole, "so the tear wouldn't show. She didn't have the money and she tried to leave, and I told her to sit down." "I know," Renee said. "I know every word." She told it like scripture. And then Renee, who owned the building they stood in and the name on its floor, took both of Nia's scarred and careful hands in her own and held them, and said, "Thank you. I have wanted to say that to you for 2 years. Thank you for my mother's happiest day." For a moment, Nia could not speak. 22 years folded shut, like a hem coming together, the kindness and the long forgetting and the strange grace of being found. She had given that gift the way she gave everything, without expecting it to ever come back. And here it was, come back, in the last place on earth she would have looked for it. It was Tessa who broke first, a small sound, her hand over her mouth, tears running freely now. And it was Tessa who said, into the silence, the thing that turned the whole room, "That's my grandmother." Renee looked at the young woman by the desk, the one who had worked in her front office for a year and never once mentioned a thing. "You're Tessa," she said. "You answer the phones. You've never said a word." "She'd never let me," Tessa managed. "She doesn't like to make a fuss." Renee laughed then, a wet laugh, and shook her head and looked back at Nia. "She doesn't like to make a fuss," she repeated. "You saved my mother's wedding, and you don't like to make a fuss." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, careless of the watching room. Then her face changed, and the businesswoman came back into it alongside the daughter, and she said, "Mrs. Carter, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take it seriously, because I mean it as seriously as I have ever meant anything." "All right," Nia said. I have a house full of the best trained tailors money can hire, and not one of them works the way you just worked on that floor. Not one of them carries a needle to a party. The thing my mother loved about you, the thing she could never explain to me. I just watched you do it for a stranger in a torn apron when you thought no one of importance was looking. That is the thing I have been trying to put back into this house for 2 years and could not buy." She took a breath. "I want you to come work with me, not as a hand, as a teacher. I want you to train the people who make the clothes that carry my mother's name. I want what you know to outlive both of us." The hall did not move. Somewhere a glass was set down on a tray with a small click. Nia, who had been told 3 times that evening that she did not belong in the room, looked at the woman who owned it, and she did not weep, and she did not crumble, and she did not gloat at the silent women who had laughed at her. She simply asked the question a working person asks, the only one that ever mattered to her. "Would I get to keep my shop?" she said. "The little place on the east side. I have brides coming in. I can't leave the brides." Renee's mouth trembled into a smile. "You can keep your shop," she said. "I'll send the brides who can't pay straight to your door, and the house will cover the thread. We can call that whatever you want to call it." "Call it the January Fund," Nia said, before she could stop herself, and Renee made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and the 2 women stood holding hands in the middle of the bright marble floor, while 200 people who had not known where to look an hour before now could not look anywhere else. It would be untrue to say the room applauded, because the room did not know yet what it had witnessed and would not fully understand it for days when the story travelled the way such stories do. The host, who had been checking his watch all evening, stepped to the microphone without quite knowing why, and he said into the quiet that the house wanted to recognize a guest tonight whose work had touched the family more than anyone had known, and he asked Nia Carter to be seen. And the women who had laughed at the homemade dress now stood and put their hands together, some of them out of shame and some of them out of a feeling they could not have named, and the sound rose and filled the hall, and Nia stood in her $4 silk and let it wash over her without letting it change her face, because she knew exactly what her dress was worth, and she always had. Camille Brandt did not clap at first. She stood at the edge of the circle, her diamond bracelet suddenly heavy on her wrist, and she watched the woman she had mocked be honored by the most important person in the room. No one had punished her, no one had said her name. That was the worst of it, in a way. The thing she would carry home and turn over for a long time afterward, the discovery that her cruelty had not even been important enough to address, that it had simply been stepped over on the way to something that mattered. Late in the evening, she came to the window where Nia stood gathering her wrap to go, and she stood there a moment with her mouth working. And finally she said, stiffly, that the dress was lovely, that she had not understood the workmanship. Nia looked at her. She could have said a great many things. She had earned the right to all of them. Instead she said, "It's all right. Most people don't see the work. That's the point of doing it well." And she meant it kindly, which was the only thing in the entire evening that Camille had not expected, and it landed harder than any rebuke could have. Camille opened her mouth and closed it and walked away. And somewhere on the drive home, alone in the back of a car worth more than a house, she would think about a woman kneeling on marble to mend a stranger's apron, and she would not be able to stop thinking about it. Tessa drove her grandmother home that night through the wet, quiet streets, the city lights smearing on the windshield, and neither of them spoke for a long while. Then Tessa said, "You never told me about Diane. All those years and you never said a word." "There wasn't anything to tell," Nia said. "I fixed the dress. People needed help. I helped them. That's not a story. That's just Tuesday." She watched the lights go by. "You don't do a kindness, so it'll come back to you. If you do it for that, it isn't a kindness. It's an investment. You do it because the person in front of you needs it, and you can. And then you forget it because remembering it would spoil it." She was quiet a moment. "But I won't pretend it didn't feel like grace tonight. To be found after all this time." She started at the house that next month, 2 mornings a week, in a bright workroom on the top floor of the building with a marble lobby. The young tailors, all credentialed, all trained at schools Nia had never been able to afford to dream of, sat around her work table while she showed them how to set a sleeve by hand, how to weight a hem with chain so the fabric moved like water, how to French finish a seam so no raw edge ever touched skin. They had thought they knew their trade. They learned under her hands how much more there was. There was a young man among them named Devon, 26, with a degree from a famous design program and a habit of finishing things fast, and he had bristled the first morning at being taught by a woman from a storefront. By the second week, he was the one who stayed late at her elbow, watching her hands the way Tessa had once watched them from a crib. Nia did not lecture him. She just worked and let him see, and now and then she would undo a seam he was proud of and hand it back without a word, and he would do it again, slower, and the second time it would be right, and she would nod. And that nod, he told someone later, was worth more than the diploma on his wall. She taught them that good work is invisible on purpose, that the whole art of it is to disappear into the wearer so completely that all anyone sees is a person who looks like herself, only more so. She taught them that a machine can join two pieces of cloth, but only a person can join them with care. They were the lessons no school had thought to give them, because they were not lessons about cloth at all. And on the other morning she kept her shop on the east side, the bell over the door, the dress forms in the window, the hand-lettered sign, and the brides still came, and the ones who could not pay now somehow always had their thread covered, and none of them ever knew why. The shop did not change. Nia would not let it. She turned down an offer to renovate the front, turned down a new sign, turned down everything except the quiet arrangement that sent her the brides nobody else would take. A girl came in one rainy afternoon with a dress that did not fit, and a wedding that week, and a purse with almost nothing in it, and she said she understood if Nia could not help her, and she put her hand on the door. And Nia, who had stood in that exact moment more than 20 years before and on the other side of it once too, set down what she was holding and said the only thing there was to say. "Sit down," she told the girl. "We have time." That's plenty. The midnight blue dress hung in Nia's closet for a long time after, and she wore it now and then to Tessa's promotion, to a wedding, to the opening of the house's new training studio, which carried a small brass plate by the door that read, at Nia's quiet insistence, nothing about her at all, only the words, "The January Fund." She never explained the plate to anyone who asked. She would just smile and say it was a long story about a kindness, and that the people who needed to know already did. Saz. Years later, when Tessa had a daughter of her own and brought her to the shop to watch her great-grandmother work, the little girl asked why the lady kept a needle in her pocket even at parties. And Nia bent over a seam in the lamplight with the bell quiet over the door, said the same thing she had said on the marble floor the night the wife of a donor learned whose work she had laughed at. She said, "You never know when someone in front of you is going to need mending, and the only thing that matters in this life is whether you are ready to help when they do." Then she bit the thread clean and tied it off and handed the finished work across the table to the next person who needed it, the way she always had, the way she always would. If you've ever done a quiet kindness for a stranger and never heard another word about it, take it from Nia that the world keeps a longer memory than you think, and that nothing good you do is ever truly lost. And if a story like this one is the kind that stays with you, there is another one waiting, about a man who shoveled the same widow's walk every winter for 9 years without ever knocking on her door, and what he found on the 10th.